Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm John Messner from Penn State University. I actually teach out of our architectural engineering program at Penn State, where we have a program that contains 4 different primary options related to buildings, particularly looking at construction, mechanical systems, lighting, electrical systems, and structural systems. So I also head up a research group at Penn State that's termed the Computer Integrated Construction Research Program, where we do a number of studies. One of the ones that I'm going to talk about in a lot more detail today is looking at how we practically implement building information modeling, both on projects and within organizations. But we also do a lot of other research. Some of it's related to the use of virtual reality in construction, and how we take models, actually show them to people in more immersive environments so that they can truly experience a building and a design before it's built, as well as looking at things related to BIM in education. So we have some really important challenges ahead of us in the industry worldwide, which is looking at how we educate future workforce and the workforce that already exists that needs to be transitioned into new ways of doing things using building information modeling, as well as other techniques like lean and looking at sustainability. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and thank you so much for inviting me here. And what I want to focus on in my talk today is really looking at how we can plan out the execution of building information modeling on our projects, and then I'll talk a little bit about owners, and in particular how owners can drive and help lead this process in different building projects in order to ensure they get what they want to get at the end of the project. So I want to start just very briefly with a definition of building information modeling. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the term, but I do this because I want to just point out the breadth of what I'd like to refer to as building information modeling. And I'll leverage a definition that was used in the National BIM standard within the United States market that looked at BIM as being kind of a threefold item. And first, looking at BIM as a product, which is the actual model that comes out of this process. So it may be in a particular proprietary format, a Revit model or something like that, but it may also be an open format, being an industry foundation class or some open format. But I think more important to a lot of the things that we do is looking at BIM as a collaborative process, and how do we put together step by step a process that people can develop this model and then be able to use it and share information forward throughout that process so that people can more effectively collaborate. And then finally, looking at BIM as a facility lifecycle management item so that we can collect data about our assets that we're building and be able to store and retrieve that data throughout that facility lifecycle to ultimately improve its operations. So we can use BIM for a lot of different things. And so just to cover a couple of these, one is we can use BIM to design. This is one of the most frequent uses of BIM, to be able to author an actual design of a facility. As we're designing, we can view different concepts virtually throughout that process and make sure that we don't have any obvious collisions between some of the 3D model content that's contained in the building. We can also use it to perform constructability analysis, be able to get that information model, be able to draw it in, and get more participation from the contractor and other parties to make sure that it's easy to construct, as well as putting together different schedules so that we can look at the construction sequence for building information modeling. We can also use it very effectively to support different types of engineering analysis, looking at how we take that design model, transition that model into more analytical tools so that we can perform energy calculations or daylight calculations or airflow modeling or structural calculations. So these are all different systems that we can look at and ultimately specify those different systems and calculate their life cycle cost. And we can also use building information modeling tools to support collecting data about existing conditions. This is just a simple laser scanning issue or laser scanning image that shows how we can go out and quickly collect 3D point clouds, be able to use and transition those point clouds into intelligent data. And then we can transition this data into record models so that we have an accurate documentation of our building as it's turned over, as well as being able to use that model for facility management so that we know and can accurately predict and prevent maintenance issues occurring throughout the building, be able to maintain that life cycle building information model so that it can be used in the next phase of renovation for that building. And so as you can see, there are many different things that we can do with building information modeling. And a lot of people have implemented a lot of these different BIM uses on different projects, and they have different importance to different project teams. But the one thing that we get a lot of times, and what really kicked off a study of ours at Penn State out of our research group, was that one day I received a phone call from a close colleague of mine, a close friend of mine, who works at the General Services Administration. So GSA, within the General Services Administration within the United States, is the largest government owner of government buildings throughout the United States. And they've been a leader in helping to put together different guides related to building information modeling and really exploring the different potential uses of BIM. But back in 2008, I received this phone call from my friend, and he said, you know, we have this new very large project, and we know that we want to use BIM, and we know that we really want to take advantage of the benefits of BIM throughout the entire life cycle of this project. And he said to me, is there a guide or some document that I can give to the project team so that they can go out and plan an implementation strategy for how we'll implement BIM throughout the entire life cycle of the project? And in 2008, unfortunately, the answer that I gave, or had to give, was no, there's not really any one place that you can go to do this. And what he was looking for, I'm not sure if you're familiar with these guides here or not, but what he was looking for was this kind of a guide, you know, a dummy's guide to building information modeling planning, and how do we create a simple plan for a building information model. Now, there are people in our industry that might get offended by this whole dummies reference in here, so I took the liberty to actually change some of the terminology here. The challenge that we have in our industry is that everyone is so busy doing different things and putting work into place that sometimes it's a real challenge to be able to sit back and appropriately plan the strategies that we want to use on different projects. And so if you're familiar with funding agencies, at least within the United States, they would not ever give money to a university to create this guide, but they did give us some money to go out and create this guide. So this is the BIM Project Execution Planning Guide that we created through a grant with the Charles Pankow Foundation and other key sponsors within the U.S. Because what happened is I was fortunate enough on the same day that I got the call from my friend from GSA is when I received a call from the Pankow Foundation, and they asked me, what is the research that you think would be most beneficial to improve our industry? And so when those two phone calls matched, we started this particular project. I want to go through a couple of just core concepts before I get into presenting some of the content that's contained within the execution planning guide. I'd like to give a little bit of background because before we developed the guide, we actually sat back and gave some thought to some of the critical concepts that we wanted to embed within the planning guide. And so the first concept that we embedded throughout our planning procedure, and this guide actually documents a 4-step structured planning procedure for implementing BIM. But one of the key things that we realized and concepts that we embedded throughout the guide was that every organization that comes to a project, and when we have a construction project, we obviously have many organizations that come to that project, whether they're designers or owners or contractors. And each of these core participants in the project come with very different experiences and very different capabilities. So some may be very technologically savvy and have the experience to develop information models. Others may not have that same experience. But one thing's clear, when we take these organizations and we put them together, we need to make sure that we design a process that works for those organizations. And so sometimes people ask me, is there one best process for implementing BIM on a project? And there's not, because we need to take into consideration the different organizations that are coming together and the experience of those organizations for considering how to best implement BIM on that project. Another term that I hear out there a lot within the US market is people talking about our project's 100% BIM. And I always ask them, what do you mean by 100% BIM? We can always model more elements on a project. We can model just the structural system, we can model every bolt, we could model every nail if we wanted to. But obviously that's not necessarily productive. And so one of the things that we looked at is, in order to set up a project for success, you need to make critical decisions on what you're going to model and at what level of detail you're going to model those different components. Another key concept is that information should be created for a purpose. And if we look back to some of the actual lean theory, we're really looking at what value does that information provide to downstream players. And so one of the key concepts that we embedded throughout this procedure is looking at pulling information through the process. So, for example, if an owner is going to use building information modeling to manage their facility, if they know exactly what attributes they need, they can pull that information out of the process by having an earlier downstream player or upstream player actually create that information for them. And in that way, they can then collect that information as they go through the process. And one last concept that we realized is that developing a comprehensive plan for implementing building information modeling on a project is not easy. One of the reasons we created this guide was to make it as easy as we could and to provide some templates that got people started on the right process and in the right way. But it takes time, and we've worked with teams on many different projects implementing a planning process, and we know that it takes time for those teams to be able to create these plans. But it certainly is a lot better than the option of not having a plan on a project. And it's therefore also critical that all of the team members realize early in a project that they need to commit the resources, which is primarily people, maybe a little bit of travel, maybe a couple of other resources, but primarily people, to get together to create these plans so that it sets the project up for success. And so when we look at an overview of this, we're really looking at a procedure that is value-focused. We want it to focus on providing value to downstream players throughout the process. We're looking at designing a process that's efficient and a focus on that process. This guide, the Project Execution Planning Guide, is project-centered. It looks at how do we set up the best process for the project. But later on, I'll talk about the organizational side of it. But the planning process for projects is project-centered. And it's also pull-driven. Pull this terminology from the lean area, because it's really looking at how do we get this value and pull the value through for the information management process. So now I'd just like to give a quick overview of some of the different items that are contained throughout the BIM Project Execution Planning Guide. So this planning guide documents a 4-step structured procedure for planning out the implementation of BIM on a project. It all starts by looking at the overarching goals. What are your project goals, and how do you want to use BIM? And it proceeds down through designing a process so that you can look at how information will flow through the process, and then documenting those specific information exchanges that need to occur in the process, and ultimately defining the infrastructure you need. And by infrastructure, what we mean is things like the network, the people, collaborative spaces that you'll need to be able to implement your process. Now, one of the things that we saw when we first went out and started to talk to people about how they planned out BIM was frequently a lot of people immediately jump to this last step in this process, which is looking at the infrastructure. They immediately think about, what applications do I currently have? What limitations do I currently have with my tools and network? And how do I design a process around what I already have? And what we wanted to encourage people to do was think about this a little bit different. And think about it from designing the ideal process and then putting an infrastructure in place to be able to support that process. Now, obviously, there's always considerations, and there's always some iteration in this to make sure that you design a process that works within some of the general resources that you already have available to you. So I want to step through some of these processes in a little bit more detail, and also highlight some of the things that are available to you in the guide that we developed. One of the things that we did early in this project was outline what are people currently using building information modeling for. And we went through and we interviewed quite a few people in the industry to talk about BIM and how they were implementing BIM on their projects, and came up with a list of 25 different BIM uses that go through the various stages of a construction project, from planning, design, construction, and operation. And these different BIM uses are illustrated on this diagram to show where they hit within that project lifecycle. But one of the interesting things that we found is that when we started to look at appropriately planning the implementation of building information modeling, it's frequently very beneficial to flip this around and really think about it from the end first. And so if you think about what you want to use BIM for in the operations phase of a project, and then move back to construction, and move back to design and planning, frequently what you'll find is if someone wants to use building information modeling in operations, it becomes much more productive for you to implement some of the earlier uses in the life cycle. And so it's very beneficial to go out and really begin with the end in mind, talking first with the owner and operator about what they would want to get out of the information life cycle on a project, and then stepping back with all of the other participants in the project. One of the other things that we created to help teams determine what they wanted to use building information modeling for is a simple spreadsheet that just allows them to go through and first identify what are these BIM uses, what is the value of implementing building information modeling for that use or purpose, who would do it if you implement BIM for that use, what are the capabilities and resources that those different project players bring to bear on the project, and then ultimately decide whether or not you want to proceed with that use. It's important for me to identify, as I go through this presentation, I'll be showing a number of these different charts. All of the information that's in the guide is actually freely available online. You can download it, as well as we put a series of all of these templates up there as well for project teams to use and be able to fill out for their project. So after you've identified what you want to use BIM for and how you want to use it, then it becomes really important to look at defining a process for implementation. And this is one of the images that I usually put up, and then I usually look at the audience and try to figure out what you're thinking. Because it's not a typical diagram that we see in our industry, at least not in the US industry. We do a lot of scheduling, obviously, throughout the industry where we're looking at network diagrams and we put together construction schedules or CPM schedules in order to be able to sequence out the construction. But it's pretty rare that we go out and actually model out the process and the information flows on a project. But I would argue that it's very important for us to do that. For us to be able to look at a project from a bit of a different perspective, model those processes that are going to be implemented, and model the exchanges. In this diagram in particular, we could take any one of these particular processes. This is a 4D modeling process. So this is taking the 3D model content, adding construction information or schedule information to it so that we can model the sequence or phasing of that construction process. So this gives you an idea of one of the BIM uses, which is to create this 4D model. And this is a process box just illustrating that the contractor would do this, and they would follow a more detailed 4D modeling process that I'll show you in just a minute. So this diagram is a level 1 process map that outlines each of those BIM uses that we were looking at in the previous step. And then at the bottom of this diagram, it's showing different information exchanges or information handoffs that need to go between one process and the other process. So if we want to do 4D modeling, we need to have the design information for the 3D model, and we need to collect the schedule information for that project in order to compile our 4D model. So after you create this level 1 process, and this should be a collaborative activity that's done by the team to sit down and map at each stage of the project, schematic design, design development, what different BIM uses are you going to use, and how are you going to tie them together with the processes performed by the other project team members. And then once you have this high-level process, by the way, that map that I showed here is pretty comprehensive. We don't see too many of them that have this many BIM uses. This is actually the template map that we put in the execution planning guide because it's a lot easier to delete than it is to add processes into a diagram. So it's just showing a pretty comprehensive implementation strategy. But once you have that strategy, then you can take any one of those processes, and we encourage project organizations, the designer, the contractor, or the owner, to map out their own internal process on how they're going to implement that particular BIM use. This just shows an example of 4D modeling where you collect the schedule information, collect the 3D information, and tie them together. But every organization may have different ways that they do these different processes. We've included in the guide a series of examples on how different organizations perform some of these different BIM processes, and have documented that so that project teams can use those. The third step in the planning process is looking at these information exchanges. So once we've mapped out our process, we know where the key handoff points need to be in that project. And then we need to define what are we going to hand off. So what is the information, what's the format, and what is the content of that information that needs to go from one participant to the next participant so that they can do their job. And we put together a template. Now, this is by no means the only template that's out there to do this, and in fact, we're considering changing this particular template in the next version of the guide. But this is a really simple format for looking at the different scopes of work or different systems that are in a building. And this is modeled off of a US categorization system called the OmniClass tables, where we have different systems here: superstructure, enclosure, roofing, interior construction. And then as you go across the side, you're looking at different BIM uses. So this would be design authoring. So what do we want in that information handoff? So do we want the floor construction? And if we do, how detailed should that floor construction be? And who should do it? And so this is just a way to be able to go through for each of those information exchanges and really start the conversation. And that's a key point here. Start the conversation between the sender of the information and the receiver of the information so that they can understand together what information one is modeling and whether or not that's adequate for the next party to use. And that becomes a very important thing later on when that information is handed over, and people understand what they can trust and what they can rely upon in that information exchange. And then a final step of the execution planning process is to look at the infrastructure that supports the implementation of this process. And so there are a number of things that are included in that infrastructure. And so what we did is we put together an overall template that project teams can use to develop their BIM execution plan. And a number of the items in that template go through these different infrastructure items. Examples of those infrastructure items are looking at meeting frequency. How often do you want to meet to go through 3D design coordination? Or when do you want to have building information model kickoff meetings as you bring on different trade contractors into the project? And how do you want to structure those meetings? As well as where will you have them? Some people right now are starting to implement projects where they get everybody together. They locate a number of the team members together so that they can collectively develop the building information model. Different people from different contractors and designers working together in a space. So these are the type of concepts that you want to think about as far as being successful with the implementation strategy. And we've outlined a structure in order to do that. But it also includes things such as simple things that can cause big problems, such as what kind of computer hardware do you need? What kind of software do you want to use? A very simple one that we see people still struggling with: what is the 0, 0, 0 coordinate that everyone is going to model to? And if you don't start these things early in a project, and if you don't start these discussions early in a project, a lot of people will go out and start to model, and they'll realize later that they cannot integrate the information that they're creating, or it becomes much more difficult to do so. So it's really important that the project team sits down and considers these different factors before they get started with the implementation of BIM. And so just this outlines the four-step procedure, but we also put together some other resources that are embedded in the execution planning guide. And one of those is just looking at a real straightforward structure for how you would create this BIM execution plan for your project. And it outlines a process where you first have a meeting to discuss what are the BIM uses and what are the BIM goals for that project. And frequently it's very important to have the key project participants involved in this meeting so that they can convey what they really want to get out of the implementation of BIM on that project. Taking away from that is usually the list of the BIM uses. And then the project team can create a process map for that and then design the overarching BIM process. And that second meeting where you're designing the BIM process usually comes down to more the management level employees who are really looking at designing a process that will work for them. After that process is defined, you can identify and document the information exchanges and then have more detailed meetings between the different modelers to define what are they going to model and at what level of detail so that they can communicate back and forth with the other modelers and understand these information exchanges. And then ultimately compiling that with the infrastructure and getting a final meeting back together to review the plan with everybody on the project. Now I will tell you, we went out and we did quite a few BIM execution plans with different people on different projects. They don't all have 4 meetings, and they certainly aren't all in this structure. And so we put together some simple agendas and everything that people can use for these meetings. But keep in mind, if it's a smaller project, you may embed 2 or 3 of these steps into one meeting. If it's a larger project, we saw people go through 8 or 9 meetings of planning out this implementation strategy. So it all depends what the scale and scope of the project is and what the availability of the team members are. We did do a lot of case studies after creating this execution planning process to be able to make sure that it was valuable to the project teams that we were delivering it to. This shows a couple of those case studies. One of the great things that we take advantage of is at Penn State University, we build a lot of buildings. We're a very large university in the United States. We have 45,000 students on our campus, and so we have a lot of buildings to support those students. And so in any given year, we're building at least 2 or 3 buildings around the campus to be able to support them. And we implement this planning procedure on each of those projects. In fact, it's a project requirement right now that we as a facility owner go out and require every project team to give us their BIM implementation plan before they do any work on that project. But we also use our students. Our students use this planning procedure on their projects that they do in classes, as well as we worked on a number of specific projects helping those teams so that we could learn more about the implementation process and some lessons from that. And we did glean some key lessons from our implementation on projects. And I just want to go through a couple of these in more detail. And one of those key lessons is for BIM to be successful on a project, it needs a champion. If no one on that project is willing to champion the implementation of BIM, it's not going to be successful. Preferably, you have more than one champion, different champions from different organizations, but you at least need one person who is willing to persevere when people want to go back to the old way of doing things on the project. The second thing is also a lesson that we learned on every successful project where we had the team create a good BIM execution planning process. The owner was always involved. And the owner was identifying the importance to them of having a good strategy in place so that they could get an efficient and high quality building. And in some instances, they could get some information at the end of the day that was critical to them. You also need to have team buy-in and some transparency, because if you're going to map out the process of implementing BIM on a project, it's really important that the project team is willing to share their internal processes. And so that became critical. Another thing is that the planning procedure should be adaptive. Not everyone follows our planning procedure precisely, and we don't care. We put it together as a template so the project teams can use it to start to do their work. If they feel they want to change something, then the project team should do that so that they buy into the process. It's also a living document. It was interesting, on one of our projects, we put together a BIM project execution plan. This was also for a GSA project, General Services Administration project for a courthouse. We put together that project plan. Within 1 year, and this was a 2 or 3 year long project, within 1 year, every project manager, from the owner, the contractor, and the designer, had left that project. But we still had the BIM execution plan in place, and they continued to pass that down to the next managers on the project. And so the process continued, and because of having a clear document and a living document, the project team could continue to implement BIM as they had originally envisioned on that project. So it just illustrates the value of having these plans put into place. And then the last one here, I said this before, but I can't emphasize it too much. It's really critical that early on the project team commits the resources to do this planning. Way too frequently we hear on projects that the designer just received the award for a project, and you say, do you have a BIM implementation or BIM execution plan? And you hear them say, we don't have time for that, we need to start modeling. And then what happens is they create a model that is of no use to any downstream participants. And so the important thing is, at the very earliest stages, when we know it's difficult, because you need to get started with other things as well, to be able to set aside enough time to do this process. And so this BIM project execution planning procedure has been adopted in the US National BIM Standard. This is just an image from the cover page of the National BIM Standard, US version 2. Was adopted in there, but I think more importantly to us is it's been adopted by quite a few different owner organizations, including the US Army Corps of Engineers, our General Services Administration, many private organizations, and several institutional owners like Penn State and other states within the United States. And what I mean by adopting is that they are requiring their project teams, just like they require a project team to deliver a schedule before they go out and build. They're requiring the project teams to provide a BIM execution plan before they go out and start modeling. And so that's a very important step forward to ensuring that the project teams are doing the planning that they need. So we implemented this, and it got a lot of press within the United States market and a lot of adopters. In fact, we've had over 15,000 downloads from our own site of the BIM execution planning guide and the templates that go with it, and we've received a lot of really positive feedback from teams that have implemented this. And so we shifted our focus about 2.5 years ago. We shifted away from a focus on the project, and we shifted to a focus on organizations. And in particular, we shifted to a focus on facility owner organizations, so that we could look at what they could use building information modeling for within their organizational processes to improve the overall facility management of their buildings. And we released a new guide. We have two versions of this. They have two very different looking covers, but this is version 2 of the planning guide, BIM planning guide for facility owners. And this guide is different because it really looks at an owner's perspective on how to implement BIM on their, throughout their organization for the project. And what we tended to see when we looked at owner adoption of building information modeling, we tended to see that owners would first start implementing BIM on a project, doing case studies, test projects, where they would ask some of their project participants, maybe the designer or maybe the contractor, to implement building information modeling on that project. And in the US market, frequently what happened is this would occur even without the owner asking. Some of the contractors would start to do 3D coordination, or the designer would start to use an application like Revit or ArchiCAD or one of the other building information model authoring tools to create a model of their facility. And so this was a project implementation. And then some of the more savvy owner organizations would put together a procurement strategy. We've helped a number of organizations with contract language. How do I go out and hire a designer to deliver a model? Or how do I hire a contractor to ensure that they do 3D coordination on my project? So putting together that procurement strategy or contracting strategy. And then several owners went through and actually did a detailed plan on BIM implementation within their organization and looking at how were they going to take these models and use them once someone delivered them to them. So that's looking at, did they have the software and hardware to read the model files once they were delivered? And could they go through and actually repurpose this information for some productive use within their organization? And then lastly, we saw a handful of owners, although only a small number, that actually looked at this from a strategic perspective and said, what is our overall strategy? And what do we really want to get out of implementing BIM over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years throughout our organization? And so a couple of people had BIM strategic plans within their group. And just like we did with the project execution planning guide, we wanted to try to flip this around a little bit and actually suggest to owners that what they should be doing is really looking initially at developing a strategic plan and what they really want to get out of implementing BIM on their projects. Then put together some more organizational execution plans of what do I need to do over the next year to make the next step. And then finally, following that up with a procurement strategy that gets embedded or buried inside of their project execution plans. And in this way, we can really strategically drive why we want to use BIM on a project, on our different projects, and the owner can maximize their value that they get from this modeling process. So we took all three of these areas. These are not different guides. Some people mistake these cover-looking things with different guides. They're not different guides. They're three different unique sections to our BIM planning guide for facility owners. And so it contains a process on how you can develop the strategy, the implementation plan, and the procurement plan. And it ties in very closely with our project execution planning guide. Another key thing that we found as we were doing this is that throughout all of these different planning processes, whether it's strategic planning or implementation planning or even the procurement process, you need to think about a certain number of core items or planning elements that reoccur over and over again. And this lays out the 6 BIM planning elements that we see throughout all of these different procedures, which are looking at your overarching strategy or why you want to do something. Looking at setting up how you're going to use BIM or what are those BIM uses, mapping a process, identifying information exchanges, setting in place the infrastructure, and last but certainly not least, focusing on personnel. And this becomes even more important as we move to organizations, making sure an organization can put the right people in place to be successful with the implementation strategy. So I'm going to walk through just a couple of things that we have in this guide to help owners through this process. And I'll start with the organizational strategy part of it. So we put together a simple 3-step procedure to lay out this organizational strategy that looked at first assessing where the organization is in its current BIM implementation. We see some facility owners who have no implementation at all. We see some facility owners, for example, in the United States, we have some hospital owners who aren't using BIM at all within their organization, but their project teams on projects are implementing BIM to a high degree of expertise. They're using it for design, they're using it for construction, and some owners don't even ask whether they're doing that or ask to get any of that information from them. So it's important that an owner sits back and assesses where they are, reaches out, interviews people, and talks to people to find out what their current level of implementation is. After assessing where you are, then looking at where do you want to get to, what is the alignment of where you would like to be, and then ultimately putting together an advancement strategy. How am I going to get from point A to point B in this particular process? And I'll show you an example of this. So this is our organizational BIM assessment profile. So this is a way that an organization can sit down, ask a couple of key questions, and this is not too long, but it asks a couple key questions in each of those planning element areas. And so by going through these questions, for example, strategy, looking at your mission and goals has been part of your overall mission and goals. What's the vision? What's the management's level of support that you have for BIM adoption throughout the organization? And mapping out where you currently are, with 0 being a non-existent level of implementation in your organization up through 5 being an optimizing level of implementation. And once you identify what that current level is, you can identify future target areas where you'd like to get to at the end of the next implementation stage. And then ultimately looking at each of these, in most instances, it starts to become self-evident in how you can move from from your current location to your future location. So obviously this is a PowerPoint slide of that, but we do have the actual templates that are in Microsoft Excel that project teams can go through, map this out, and they get a nice diagram, spider diagram as well, showing where they are on that BIM maturity for their organization, and they can track that over time. The other thing that we put together is just some descriptions of an approach that can be used for road mapping, but we see a tremendous amount of variation, and I'll show you one example in a little bit of how a different organization roadmap their implementation. But we put together a simple way to go through looking at each of these planning elements, putting together a roadmap based on different time periods of how you want to move from one level of maturity to another level of maturity inside of each of those planning elements. This is just a simple example from our own Office of Physical Plant. They've actually redone this just recently. I don't have the latest version, but this was their very first version of that. The second area is to put together these more detailed implementation plans. So once you've road mapped out that over the next year I want to do the following items, and in 2 years I want to do this, and 5 years I want to do these things, then you want to put together an implementation plan of just that first phase. How am I going to get from today to 1 year from now and be successful at achieving the goals that I set out in my overall roadmap? And so in order to do that, you need an implementation plan for that next period. And so we put together the organizational plan as a template that actually has an awful lot of similarities to our project execution planning template, although it's organizationally focused. And so it steps down through these different 6 planning elements and provides some guidelines and templates and ways to plan out the implementation for each of these 6 areas. Just some examples, we have a slightly different BIM uses table in this because we were focused specifically on facility owner organizations and how you can use BIM to help your organization manage your assets and maintain your facilities. We also mapped out some of those processes in additional detail so that owners can look at some template maps on how they may want to implement BIM within their organization. And we put some different tables in there for how they can document the information that they want to get out of the process. And so you could use our BIM project execution planning templates for this, but frequently an owner wants to get more specific. For example, at Penn State, we have a very specific attribute list that defines for each pump on the project, we want the following 8 attributes of that, and we want it in a very specific format because we want to pull it in to our facility management system and be able to use that as soon as the building is turned over to us. And so those are documenting this specific information exchange to the owner. And then finally, the third part in this owner's guide is looking at the procurement strategy and how we document the procurement strategy on a project. And we came up with and leveraged what some of our colleagues were using in this area, which is requiring by contract, by the main agreement, the use of BIM for specific purposes, and then also putting in place a template project execution plan that already had the owner's desires embedded in that plan. So if I as an owner know that I want to use BIM for managing my facilities, I can customize the project planning template that we released to say this is a required use. It is no longer optional, and we're not going to discuss it. This is a required use, and here is exactly what I want to get out of that process. And by doing that, you can create these customized plans that make it very clear to the team what the desires of the owner are, and that those desires are then embedded inside of the contracts to ensure that they're delivered at the end of the day. We also put together some team evaluation forms. This is a big challenge in the industry right now in figuring out whether teams can deliver what you want them to deliver from a modeling perspective. And so this just goes through how to document that implementation. And that leads us right back down then to the final area for owners, which is actually implementing on projects and getting engaged with the project teams as those project teams create those BIM execution plans on their projects. So I want to go through a quick example just to illustrate how one owner implemented the content that's in our owner's guide. And I'm going to jump through this fairly quickly, so bear with me. But this is an example from Digital Realty. Digital Realty is a developer in the U.S., but they also do projects internationally as well. They're a U.S.-based developer of data centers. So they go out and create large data centers that are used by a number of the large internet companies. And their real mission here is to create customer-driven data center solutions. A key thing, their mission is not to use BIM. Their mission is to deliver something to their customers, and so BIM merely is one way to support their overall corporate mission. And that's how they need to view the implementation of BIM, is how can BIM support their core mission within their organization. And so every owner organization or developer organization is going to answer that question very differently. So I'm just going to give you an example of some of how Digital Realty answered that question. So this is just showing the location of some of their different data centers that they've developed. And they're a pretty interesting developer for data center, private developer for data center projects, in that they have really embraced some of those same topics that we're all talking about right now. They've really embraced the concept of lean delivery and being able to go through and plan out their process with key stage gates and decide whether or not to proceed with the different development initiatives. They're very product-based design, and by that I mean they look to modularize these data center pods and sit one right beside the other, and then connect those different pods. So when they looked at BIM, they looked at BIM as a way to design a reusable pod that could then be copied and tailored to the site-specific conditions within that area. So tremendous ability to leverage that information for reuse purposes. And they also are really focused on an integrated supply chain and working with particular suppliers, designers, and contractors over and over again for repeat business to be able to duplicate across multiple places. And so because of some of these core fundamental principles that they have, really BIM provides a lot of support to them throughout the implementation of their corporate strategy. So they went through just the strategic planning process to assess, align, and then advance their strategy. And in the assessment, one of the things that they did, they actually pulled away one of our graduate students for a summer to do an internship with them. And they had him go out and interview people from all their different corporate offices and try to understand how they were using information in facility management and how they were engaging with their suppliers to look at the information exchanges between their organization and their different suppliers. And so that took them several months to interview the different people and to understand the fundamental items that they're using information for and where they could really gain value from implementing building information modeling. And they really highlighted a couple key areas that were important to them. One was looking at 3D visualization so that they could use it to communicate with their future clients, which may be large internet-based firms like Google and so forth that need to use these data centers, and so the ability to communicate with those organizations is important. Using it as a basis of design to be able to repeat the delivery of a consistent strategy in these pods that they use on the different projects. Using it as an information flow so that they could automatically transfer this to their fabricators and their operations side, and then ultimately using it for data management in the managerial and maintenance part of the project. And so that's what they came out of this assessment with, was really what they wanted to get out of the implementation of building information modeling from analyzing. And then when they went through the alignment process, they really looked at how could they map out some of these core processes to achieve what they wanted to achieve. And you can see here, it was kind of interesting. I said we encourage people to adapt what we use, and so they felt that it was important for them to map out this process with multiple tracks that they could implement on their different projects. So it's a bit of a different strategy than what we had looked at, but you can see here they put together a timeline and they mapped out which of the different BIM uses they wanted to use. For example, in year 1, they wanted to get people to start authoring the design in a BIM tool, and they wanted to use it for 3D coordination. In year 2, they wanted to use it as the core basis of design, do design reviews, model existing conditions, and start to get some of the record models. So they were actually looking at, over a timeline, how were they going to implement BIM on their different projects. And then they also mapped this out so that they could identify what did they need to do as far as getting the procurement language in place, getting the standards in place to be able to support project teams to deliver the information that they needed to deliver. So they just mapped this out as a simple timeline to do that. So I just wanted to show you that as one example. We worked with a number of organizations on this implementation, and every one of them was different. I will tell you, it's easier to plan out BIM in a project than it is to plan BIM integration into an organization. And in particular, owners are a challenge. And so every owner has different goals, and you need to tailor the implementation strategy to help them achieve their goals and their overarching vision, of which none of the owner organizations have an overarching vision to implement BIM. Their overarching vision is to do something else. And so BIM is merely a support of that something else. So I want to reflect a little bit back to the past 5 years. It's been a fun 5 years of putting together these 2 guides, and we've received a lot of good feedback on them. And I think there's a couple key things that we take from that. And one of those is that it's really, really important to be able to begin with the end in mind when we go out and start this planning process, and really focus on value. Because that's the key to successfully implementing BIM, is to convince people that there is value in doing so, and to design a strategy that's going to deliver that value to them. And I do want to take some time to thank a couple of key people in this. I always get up and talk about it. Actually, we have a number of other people that talk about it too, which is good. But we have a tremendous amount of support for these projects. And one way is support financially from these different organizations. In particular, the Charles Pankow Foundation has been a really generous contributor to our work. We also have a very active and engaged advisory board with some of the top names in implementing BIM throughout the United States market listed on that. And we have a lot of students who've done their graduate work, and several other faculty members who've been very engaged in designing this planning work. And so now I want to get to homework. All faculty members give homework, right? So that's my job too. And what I would like each of you to do when you leave here, and I know you're all from different positions, some of you in companies, some of you in students at the university. So I just want to give you a couple of things to think about as you leave here. And the first one is to go out and download the guides if you didn't already do so. So they're freely available, as I said before. I'll give you the web address at the end at bim.psu.edu. I'm just realizing I put the older version 1 image of the facility guide up there. We hired a graphic designer in between who jazzed up the image a bit. But go download those guides. If you're an owner, how many owner organization representatives do we have here? People from owners. Okay, so a couple, great. So if you're from an owner organization, what I'd like you to do is start expecting your project teams to put these plans together. So if a project team is going to work on one of your projects, and if they're going to do any level of building information modeling, they should have a plan on how they're going to do it. And so I would expect or require contractually that project teams start to deliver to you these different execution plans. And if you're from any other organization, I would still expect or require that your project team put together one of these plans, because it's valuable to the team. It's not just a contractual deliverable. It is a valuable process for the project team to go through and plan out their implementation strategy so that they reduce waste throughout this process. I'd like all of you to go out on the next project that you're working on, or the current project that you're working on, and be able to implement this planning procedure on that project, but also think about how you can implement the planning procedure within your organization. I'll tell you a little secret is that we put together the owner's guide for planning out BIM implementation within a facility owner organization. We specifically tailored it to the owner organization, but I'll tell you, probably 90% of it is equally applicable to every other organization within our market, whether it be a designer, an engineering firm, a contractor, a specialty trade. You can still use that same process to plan out your integration strategy of BIM into your organization. And so while it says for facility owners, that was a great way for us to get the support we needed economically to develop that guide. It is equally valuable, I think, for other organizations to use that. So please look at it, even if you want to integrate it into your own organization. I would also say we are always modifying these documents. And we release a new version of each of these guides about once a year. We're in the process of going through another round of revisions here in the next several months. So we'd love to hear your feedback. Any challenges you have, any things you think could improve the guide, we'd love to hear those. And I do want to recognize that doing these planning processes, and I'm sure as you've sat here and listened to me talk about all of these different planning processes and procedures, you think, gee, that will take time, and it does. And it's not easy, and we understand that, but it's very important for both your projects and your organizations to do that. And I do want to say we're not done yet, and we have some interesting opportunities that we're exploring right now. We did conclude the second version of the owner's guide. We just released, I shouldn't tell you this after I present what's in the guide, but we just released a new document a couple of weeks ago that looks at a different way of categorizing these BIM uses. We liked what was in the guide. It's easy, it's recognizable by industry, it uses a lot of the same terminology. But we went out and put together a different categorization system that you may see in the next version of the guide. So that's also available on our website if you're interested. It's called the BIM Uses, a guide to BIM uses. And all it does is outlines a different way of categorizing those BIM uses. We are also looking at coming up with some very specific follow-on work that helps people implement BIM on particular types of projects. And the first one we're focused on is energy retrofit projects, and how project teams can implement a consistent workflow. As we go to more specific domains and more specific types of projects, we can provide some more specific guidance on how you can implement BIM to be successful on those projects. So that's another thing that we're doing. So I want to just thank you for your time today, and encourage you once again to go out, download these resources if you haven't done so. And I'd love to hear and talk with you further about some of the opportunities for successfully planning BIM on your projects and inside of your organizations. So thank you very much.
So, thanks, John, for your good timing, but now there will be questioning for sure. Nii, kus on nüüd need poisid mikrofonidega? Üks on seal, on veel, teine seal. Nii, kes tahab küsida, see peab selle poisi kätte saama ja tema riista katsuma ja sinna sisse rääkima. Palun, laske käia. Näidake näpuga, kes tahavad. Kõik naeravad, ei ole vahva, aga no kus küsimused on? I will start questioning if you don't mind.
Okay.
Well, you advertised us your bestsellers, just the guidebooks. And actually, what is the feedback from the public, from the audience? Well, who are downloading them? Are these actually the owners, or are they professionals of the sector? And really, well, what's the feedback?
Yeah, we ask for people to share their information when they download, just who they are and what organization they're with. And we have a tremendous variety of different people download these guides. So anything from designers and contractors probably make up the highest percentage because they're implementing BIM on projects and looking to get feedback on that. And then we also have quite a few owner organizations and some consultants who, frankly, in the US market, there are people that make their living going out and helping people devise plans and strategies for implementing BIM, both on their projects and inside of their organizations. And so some of those folks as well download some of these guides and reference that. So there's a large number. When we looked at the project level guide, we have over 15,000 people who have downloaded that. So I never ran the percentages on which people, but there's quite a few variations. For the owner's guide, we have fewer people who have downloaded it. It's been out less, but we still have over 3,000 people who have downloaded that owner's guide to be able to look at ways of adopting it.
No nii, siin paistab juba.
Yes, hello. I work for an architecture and engineering company, and about the BIM process and integration. Should we start from a specific project, or should we start an overall plan for the company?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I just showed you how to initially start with creating that overarching strategic plan, but I think there's benefit in doing some of both. I think it's critical that an organization work toward creating a strategic plan, but frequently it's beneficial to have some pilots out there as well. So I would recommend starting small, starting on some smaller pilot projects, hopefully on projects where you can find some team members who are also interested in working with you, so that you can do some of the collaborative building information modeling instead of just more of the isolated BIM implementation. But starting small and at the same time start to build that overall strategic plan of how your organization really wants to leverage the implementation of BIM inside of your organization to take you to the next level of achieving your goals.
Nii, küsimus oli siin ka.
So my question is, how does this BIM implementation scale if I want to use it, for instance, a private house or a villa?
I'm sorry, what was the very end of your question there? If you want to use it for designing a private house or a villa, should I start there, or the examples you showed us were big, huge projects? Yeah, a lot of the things that we do are with larger commercial owners, but I've certainly seen examples of residential designers and contractors making very effective use of building information modeling. They may use very different tools. It's interesting, I don't know the specific tools that you have in your marketplace. In the US, we have actually some really interesting, very low-cost applications that help you create a model for a house, a residential house. They may help you do takeoffs, quantity takeoffs, so that you have a bill of materials, and they may help you do a lot of other things. So I think the whole concept of creating a model, implementing it on a project is definitely scalable. When we were looking to put an addition on our house, of course I had to have a model of that. I couldn't resist that. But you know, I think even just simple, smaller projects, there are opportunities for leveraging BIM, and but it really depends. You probably use a different tool set than some of the tool sets that are used on the large commercial projects, because a lot of those aren't necessarily tailored to a smaller scale of building.
nii, teised ja poisid tahavad küsida.
Kas ma võiks ka ühe küsimuse siit vahelt varsti?
Okay, I will ask my question. I'm from an engineering company. We have been implementing BIM now for different tools already for several years. And actually, I am using these tools for myself, because I'm a construction engineer. It's for me, I see it gives the benefit for me, and it gives the benefit for our company together, but often it stops there. I mean, it stops there inside our company. For a particular project, I had this model made pretty good detail level, and I showed it to the client and said, well, you are a builder. The client was a builder. You could use this model on your building site, and my question and my thoughts here are, should I, as an engineering company, to be the one who tells the contractor or the client, you could use this, or should actually the come from the other way around, that at first the client thinks what he wants, or what could be the benefits, or should it be like together we sit on the table and we say, well, here we have these BIM solutions you could use in the future in this and that way, and also often the client sees this as an extra cost, as okay, you are doing it in BIM, how does it cost then? Well, for me, I am doing it in BIM anyway, but of course if I then export it to them, then I have to put it in some kind of package, or of course it is a little bit extra, but do I have to explain the client what are the benefits, or where should this process start?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there's a lot of, obviously some of this depends on your business model, but I can maybe just reflect back on what I've seen a number of organizations do. And so I think there's a lot of value, if you're already using BIM, in being able to communicate to the other project team members, the owner, maybe the contractor, or other project team members, what you're doing and how it may be of benefit to them. I think ideally at the beginning of a project or early on, you'd have a more open discussion, so that you can discuss what's possible and define what's appropriate for that particular project. We've seen a lot of people use building information modeling, or who have already been using building information modeling, but clients may or may not have been aware of it, to be able to use that to be able to market and build very dependable repeat business. Because if they can see that you're using building information modeling, and if they can see the value that it's providing some of the downstream participants on the project, then that certainly can provide value to the owner or to some of those other project participants. The cost thing's an interesting one. I think we hear a lot of different discussions on cost of implementing BIM. The very earliest stages of BIM implementation in the US market, I heard a lot of the larger architects and engineering firms talking about how much it would cost them to start to implement BIM. And there certainly is a cost to buying into using BIM as a process. But I think the conversation has shifted now in the market, at least within the US market, that a lot of design firms are using BIM as their standard practice. So there is no added cost beyond their standard practice. It's just the way that they do business. Now there may be some added costs if you need to do custom exports or other specific things to move information back and forth, but we usually find that those costs are fairly minimal, especially compared to some of the value of implementing that. So I'd really encourage you to look for opportunities to talk to more people about how they might be able to leverage some of the things you're doing.
Nii, Ergo, sul oli midagi ebaselget.
jah, mul oli üks kiire küsimus. So I'll make it very short because we only have a couple of minutes left. You talked about, or actually you have developed a planning framework for the owners and also for the project participants. We have different levels of planning. We have the strategic level, then we have the implementation level, and etc. How about the clients? I don't know how is it in the States, but we still have many clients who have no experiences, no understanding of BIM possibilities at all. So how to begin with those people? And who should be responsible for actually developing the content into those plans and templates that you have developed?
Yeah. So a lot of what we've seen from owners who are just getting started is in the same way for a project, there needs to be some champion. There needs to be somebody in that organization who may or may not be a BIM expert, but who has the drive to implement it, and has the ability to find the resources to be able to do that implementation planning. We've seen a lot of the larger owners go out and actually bring in new people, hire new people to help them with that planning process. They may be consultants, they may be someone from an architectural firm or someone else who is a BIM implementer who they can pull in that they trust to be able to help them with that planning process. Or one of the other things that we've seen for definitely a larger organization is that they may go out and actually make a strategic hire to bring someone in to champion that process. That obviously isn't going to happen in a smaller owner organization, but we've seen in some of the larger organizations, large government organizations, where they go out and make a strategic hire to be able to start that planning process. But even if you don't have that, I think it's, you can still start with small steps. So as long as you have someone within the organization who has an interest in BIM, I think they can start some of these pilot projects and start some of this implementation strategy even before they coalesce a larger group. One of the first things we do recommend is, once you have a champion or you have that person who's going to lead the initiative, it's also critical that they find key people in different departments that influence this implementation strategy to form a core group. And we have some suggestions outlined on how to do that inside of the planning guide on who you should try to get engaged in this process so that you have a broader buy-in. Because if you don't have that buy-in, your implementation isn't going to be successful.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. We have a couple of experiences from Estonia, and for example, we were asking from the owners that now we are preparing the models for you. What is the information that you actually want to get out of those models? And he couldn't answer to our question.
Yeah. And it's a tough answer for owners. It's not easy.
Nii, kas seal oli veel, kes kättega vehkisid? Jah.
Good morning. I'm from a state real estate company. It's like a GSA in the States. Mm-hmm. And I have a question. I can say I am a BIM believer, but how to implement in the BIM in corporate level if you do not have in Estonia players in several stages? We have design companies who already doing the design in BIM. We already know how to implement BIM in facility management a little bit, but the majority of construction companies doesn't do BIM in construction stage. How to implement BIM in corporate level in that situation?
Yeah, it's interesting because we had a scenario. So Penn State University, where I work, is actually located in the center of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's big rectangle. If you draw an X over it, we're located in the center. We're not located near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We're not located near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, some of the big cities. We are a small entity that exists in the middle of the state. And our contractors 5 years ago certainly did not implement BIM on almost any of their projects. We only had 1 or 2 contractors who would implement in that area because it's not one of the big cities where there's more implementation. And so in that scenario, we as an organization, the university, decided that we would start requiring the adoption of BIM. And I can tell you that we paid a premium for doing that on some of our earlier projects because the contractors did have to come up to speed on using BIM. They had to learn how to model. And since there was no clear player that knew how to model already that could be more competitive, we understood that we would have to invest a little bit to bring the market up. So we actually made a conscientious decision that we would accept the fact that on 1 or 2 projects we were going to pay a premium, and we implemented BIM. And we tried to support the contractors as best we could. Our research group helped out in a number of those supporting initiatives. We provided the resources on where they could get trained in order to bring up their staff. And we had, frankly, varied success on the first project or 2 because in particular some of the specialty trades, concrete, masonry, some of those other trades didn't know how to use BIM as well as we would have liked them to know how to use it. But I'll tell you, it's 5 years later. Every one of our projects is delivered with BIM. Our contractors know how to use it. And every contractor that bids on one of our projects knows that they need to model their work. And so it was a tough decision. I still remember the meetings that we had when we sat down and realized that we would be paying extra money. We initially started them, how much would it cost if you use BIM and how much if you don't use BIM. In every instance it would be more, and we paid it. But now we don't pay a premium. And in fact, about 2 years ago, we bid one of the largest projects that we ever had, and the mechanical trade came back to us and shared with us that they cut their bid by 5% because they knew they would not have the field conflicts that they have on their average job. And so now we're starting to yield the benefits of that. But it was took a couple years to do that, and it's not an easy decision, and it's not an easy time to help the whole industry come up to the standard that you want them to deliver for you.
Thank you, John. Nii, nüüd on lugu nii, et mina vaatan muidugi kella ja vastavalt tööseadusandlusele nii pikalt istuda ei tohi, nagu me juba istunud oleme. Seega ärge enam kätega vehkige, mis ei tähenda, et ka hiljem ei võiks küsimusi esitada. Aga graafiku järgi meil peab olema, on ette nähtud vähemalt 15 minutit, et selle jooksul 20-minutiline paus teha. Nüüd paraku lepime kokku, kuna on juba 11.25, et 11:40 igal juhul olen ma siin puldis ja jutt läheb edasi.